Hello, and welcome to the third video of our course, Theories and Thinkers. This is for the first week still, and I am really going to work hard at keeping this to under 15 minutes. So let's get started. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the psychoanalytic perspective on development. And I just want to let you know that these are very brief overviews of all of the theories that this textbook decided was important for you to know about. And really, these are kind of the greatest hits of theorists in terms of especially child development. So if you were to take Psych 1, you would recognize all of these people as being important and probably talked about in Psych 1, and also in any child development class. You'll also see these theorists, and we will probably later in the course go into each one of these in more detail. So I'm going to try to stay brief. And as we talk about psychoanalytic perspectives, the first thing to mention is that this is sort of the first one. Before Freud, there really wasn't anything to be considered psychology. It was all considered philosophy. But Freud instituted this idea that human development is driven by forces that people are unaware of. And he called this the unconscious. Just like we're not necessarily aware of all the drives that, like we're not aware that we need to eat until we're hungry, and we're not aware that we're thirsty. Similarly, we have these drives, and they drive our actions. And we have these unconscious desires, and they drive individuals to try to satisfy a series of pre-programmed needs that become relevant at different ages. So according to Freud, certain desires are maybe louder or less loud at different times. They demand being met at different ages. Freud emphasized sexual needs, and later, probably about 40 years later, Erikson emphasized that unconscious social needs also need to be met, that we need something from each other, and we also need something in terms of how we feel about ourselves in relationship to other people that we're not necessarily conscious of, but we're still driven to meet them. So psychoanalysis emphasizes the unconscious. And more specifically, Freud, he was pioneering of the theory. His work, think that it was around the 1900s. He worked in Vienna, and he has this psychosexual emphasis. He emphasized that different sexual needs must be gratified at different ages, and some of these needs may be over-gratified, and some may be under-gratified, and depending on that, it will either lead to healthy development or abnormal development. Sometimes individuals may get stuck at some of these stages. So you may have heard somebody just in everyday language say, "Oh my God, he's so anal," which in everyday language in our world means, "Oh, they're so fixated on details. Don't be so anal." And basically that phrase comes from, this idea that if you don't get your anal needs met, according to Freud, you develop certain personality characteristics. I don't know if you can see my little face in the corner, but I can't really talk about this without making some faces, because and it bothers me that this is the first theorist I have to tell you about, because it's so kind of gross, quite frankly. Now this theory is seen as overemphasizing sexual desires in children. And it's wrong-headed about the experiences of girls and women, quite frankly. But because he was the first, and because his ideas have been so influential for so long, it is important that you know that in infancy, it's thought that humans need to gratify their need for oral sensation, toddlers, anal sensation. Early childhood phallic fixation, which phallic means penis, if you didn't know, and I'm like, yeah, that's great. You know, yeah, anyway, it doesn't really fit for girls, but I guess back in the 1900s in Vienna, that didn't really matter. Later childhood is thought to be this latency period where you're not really acting out on any or trying to fulfill any sexual needs, but rather you're learning the mechanisms of suppressing your sexual needs. And then when puberty comes along, he calls it the genital phase, when you're actually sort of pursuing the real gratification of sex itself. So that's Freud's psychosexual stages. Erikson's stages, he revised this psychoanalytic perspective while holding on to the idea that there are these unconscious forces. He started out in Vienna and worked with Freud's daughter named Anna Freud, but moved to Berkeley and did a lot of his work there, which is right up the road from here, right? He has a psychosocial emphasis. So he's looking at the human being in a social setting and needing to gratify social needs. He was influenced by Maria Montessori. You may have heard of Montessori schools. I'm going to find a way to talk more about her at some point because she's pretty cool. So there are these different social needs that must be met at different ages, and Erikson talked about them in terms of being crises. And don't worry, crises isn't like, I'm panicking. Crises is just sort of the question that needs to get answered at these different stages. But Erikson was important because a lot of these early thinkers were just focusing on development up until, say, 20 or so. But Erikson said the human being develops across the lifespan. So Erikson could be considered one of the first well, maybe Shakespeare was first, but one of the first psychologists who focus on the lifespan perspective. There's a big emphasis on identity with Erikson, and we are definitely going to read more about Erikson's ideas. They're very influential, and they're good. There's not all that much empirical evidence for some of this stuff. There's some empirical evidence for it, but I think it's more interesting from the perspective of organizing principles. So down here are all the different stages, and rather than go into them now, I think I'm just going to wait and let's talk about these different stages when we hit them, okay? These cognitive perspectives are in contrast to psychoanalytic perspectives in that cognitive theories emphasize your thought, your consciousness, your conscious thought. And that is the primary characteristic of human development, sort of our intelligence, our thought, what we know, how we think. This is sort of what fuels how we change. And so this focuses not just like what we think, but how we think and what are our capacities for thought. And you'll see that in a second. Piaget emphasized logic and reasoning, and sort of how do you make sense of knowledge from a sort of scientific perspective. We'll get into that in a second. And Vygotsky emphasized being taught, that children are taught by adults to use the tools of culture, which would include something like math or language or different concepts within the culture. And so there's this big emphasis on adults teaching children. The information processing perspective emphasizes component parts of actual thought processes themselves, including how do you encode information? Where do you store it? How do you retrieve it? And so the information processing is breaking down each component of thought, much like you would understand how a computer stores and encodes, stores, and retrieves information. So Piaget, he worked in Switzerland in the 50s is when he did most of his publishing. His emphasis is on the nature of knowledge and how we construct it. So you come out of your mom and you're not necessarily knowing too much, and somehow you start to know things. So his question was, how does that happen? He also became intrigued because he did a lot of observing of children, and he became intrigued by the similar types of mistakes that children at certain ages were making. So, a 3-year-old would make the same type of mistake as another 3-year-old. And whereas a 7-year-old wouldn't even make that mistake, nor would most 7-year-olds. So this sort of became the root of his stage theory. He also looked at this as this constant interplay between what the child already knows and how to make sense of new information in light of what the child knows. And so we'll get into that in more detail too. He basically saw children as little scientists. When they interact with their worlds, they form theories. I think if I push this off my high chair, it's going to fall from the floor. Okay, what if I push it harder? And then they can see it falls further from the floor. What if I push it softer? They can see. So you see these children repeating their actions and testing their theories. And essentially, Piaget saw that children start interacting in the first phase. It's so focused on senses and just making sense of their senses. They're touching, they're biting, they're chewing, they're feeling. How big is that? What color is that? They're just making sense of their senses when they're infants. And then in the pre-operational stage, actually, I'm not going to talk about each of one of these because we will definitely get into it later. But that's an introduction to Piaget. Vygotsky, now he's focusing on the social influences of adults. He published in Russia in the 30s, and much to our misfortune, he died in his 30s. So he's this brilliant guy, and had a lot to say about how children learned, and really made the parent-child or the teacher-child relationship really important, because he said that it's this social interaction and culture guide development and thought. So their basic thought is structured by how you're taught to use language, etc. He also had this concept of the zone of proximal development. I should have capitalized that D. And this is, just so you know, the zone of proximal development is this sweet spot where the child learns. And it's a level, like here's what the child can do, and they can do no more by themselves. But then, if someone helps them, they can do just a little bit more. But then there's this level beyond which, they couldn't do it even with help. So he says target this zone of proximal development when trying to teach a child. So that's Vygotsky. We'll hear more from him too. The information processing perspective uses this idea of computer as a metaphor for how the mind works. I think we already mentioned that it deals with components of cognition, such as encoding, storage, and retrieval. And it's really emphasizing, instead of these stages, which Piaget says, it's like, nope, we're just learning. We're just incrementally adding a little bit to each one of our capacities, and we become better and better and better at them. So behavioral and social cognitive perspective, behaviorism has a strong emphasis on investigating only what is observable. And behaviorism is suspicious about things that can't be measured, such as the unconscious or even cognitive thought processes. You can't necessarily measure them observably. You can't look at them and watch them. Of course, now neuroscientists and being able to scan the brain, you're able to actually observe thought processes in ways that back in the day, in Skinner's day, for example, you never could. So these theories conceive of development as a process of adopting and adapting behaviors to suit the environment. Skinner focuses on how individuals change their behavior based on the rewarding or punishing consequences that result from behaviors. So think of, that's called operant conditioning. Bandura focuses on how individuals model their behavior based on behaviors they observe in others. So it's a sort of social observational modeling. So here's Skinner. Isn't he handsome? Oh man. He worked a lot with animals and trained pigeons and rats and stuff with it to sort of behave in specific ways that he intended for them to behave by strategically delivering rewards and punishments for their behavior. And so then he extended this theory to say that humans learn through this very same mechanism, and he sort of emphasized this idea that it's all nurture, man. It's not nature. We come out of the gate blank slates. There's not much that's pre-programmed in us, and through rewards and punishment, we learn to behave the way we learn. That's Skinner's perspective. And it's different than Bandura. Bandura worked in the 60s, and he's still alive. I just saw he published something in 2015. Bandura's super cool and a bit of a hero of mine. The more I learn about him, I actually want to know more about him. But he has this social cognitive theory, and he's like, hey, wait a minute. Behavior doesn't just happen because of what is rewarded and punished. We're also learning by watching. We imitate people. And so he emphasized that the thoughts that we have when we observe people doing their thing, it fuels our development. That's the social cognitive part. He's also known for his work on aggression and the Bobo doll experiment, and also very well known for self-efficacy. So that's that perspective on development. Now we're into the over time. I see it, but I'm just going to keep moving. The ethological perspective. Ethology is the study of human behavior from a biological perspective. What is it about our biology that makes us do what we do? And so much of theories associated with ethology really has an evolutionary perspective, where we ask, how did our species adapt to survive in its environment such that we are biologically predisposed to certain behaviors? Lorenz is the name here, where that focused on this critical period of imprinting on caregivers that some species have, in particular geese. And Bowlby theorized that humans have this similar type of critical period where if you don't get it in this critical period, you're going to miss your opportunity and it's all going to go away. So infants at a certain age, they've got to bond with their caregiver, and if they don't, things are going to go terribly wrong. So let's just see a little bit about Lorenz. There he is with his geese. Essentially, he observed that geese would follow the first moving thing that they saw, and that the moment after hatching is this critical period for offspring to see the moving thing, and they'll attach to their parent. Because what he ended up doing, you can see he's kind of fatherly toward this geese, is he got geese to attach to him. He had the eggs, he had them warm, they were ready to go, and when they hatched, he was the first moving thing that they saw, so they followed him. And so this is sort of the basis of his thinking on critical periods. He actually won a Nobel Prize for this work. So this evidence that there's this innate predisposition that's biologically based for members of a species to behave in certain ways that promote the survival of that species. So for us, humans, and we'll see, I'll just skip to Bowlby. Well, not Bowlby, but they're saying the same thing. Humans have this critical period where they've got to attach to a caregiver, because if a human being doesn't attach to a caregiver, the human being is going to get left behind a bush and the lions are going to eat it, because that baby can't run, it can't fight, it needs the protection. So it is evolutionarily important for humans to be protected by caregivers. So Bowlby took these ideas, or they coincided in many ways, but he worked in London in the 40s and 50s. He also worked in orphanages after the war, but he observed that maladjusted children had often been separated from their mothers at critical times. So he proposed this formal theory of attachment to caregivers, that should say, as a necessary component of early development. And this theory was greatly expanded by Mary Ainsworth, shout out to the ladies, who operationalized different aspects of the theory. We'll talk a lot more about attachment later. The ecological perspective emphasizes the impact of the environment in which a person grows up as being primarily important to development. It offers different ways of thinking about a complex environment where different systems are nested. Like, say, you've got family that's nested in community, which is then nested in country, right? And so these systems interact with each other and they interact with the individual. So Bronfenbrenner is the name that's associated with this ecological perspective. And I just gave you another picture of that. Here's your individual who lives in a microsystem of family, peers, siblings, and who lives within, there's also a mesosystem, but I don't want to talk about that, an exosystem where there's extended family, school board, neighbors, mass media, parents' work environment. It may be that, like my husband who is Indian, his extended family is definitely in the microsystem. They're not on the outside. So there's different ways to determine this, but there's like it's determined in terms of the degree of closeness. So Bronfenbrenner is very influential in at least trying to help developmentalists embrace the complexity that is human development, embrace all of these multiple environmental forces by having a way to even talk about what those environmental forces are. He was also very important to the Head Start program. So it's been 20 minutes, and I'm going to say that the book, Sand Chalk is our book, as you know by now, emphasizes that they have an eclectic orientation to developmental theories, where they don't follow any one theoretical approach, but select from each theory whatever is considered to be its best features. So that's kind of what what we can see as we look at all of these theories is you can see how they kind of deal with a different aspect of development that is valid and important, and you can't possibly say everything there is to say about development in one breath, or even one thinker, or even one book. So the use of all of these different perspectives can be brought together, used simultaneously to help us understand each different stage of life, or each as we move through the lifespan. I want to make two more points. One is that the ladies are underrepresented in this textbook. I'm sorry, but women have made important contributions to psychology and developmental science. This is Maria Montessori. I love her work. I'm going to try to, learn more about it myself and bring more of it into this class. This is Mary Ainsworth, without whom the attachment theory wouldn't have even worked, because it took her to operationalize, like, what do we mean by secure attachment? And this is Karen Horney. She was a psychoanalyst who had amazing things to say, and I don't have time to talk about it, but I wanted to let you know that there are women that have contributed to developmental knowledge, and we didn't get to read about them in the textbook. And one more last point is we have a lot of missing perspectives. If you'll notice, these are all white guys, white men telling us how we live and work. And I'm of the I hold the belief that all of these all these white guys' ideas and theories are interesting and inform us, but they're nowhere near the whole picture. So we haven't seen anything from Africa or India or Asia or South America. And there are different ways to conceptualize human life and what it means to grow and develop across the lifespan. So if I can, I'm going to try to look for and bring in as many different, like at least some smattering of these ideas, so that we don't stop and think, well, this is all there is to the story. This is just one. When in this class, we are going to use these theories, and they're going to help us get at what the story is about human development. And we're also going to be humble about it. And we're going to know that we don't have the whole picture. And that, my friends, is the end of this.